Hello, I'm David McKitterick. I was librarian of Trinity College in Cambridge for many years, and also the honorary professor of historical bibliography in Cambridge. My entire life, or my career, has been spent partly looking after libraries and partly writing books. So I come to this project with two things in mind. First of all, where are libraries going? What should we worry about? And secondly, most importantly, how do readers use libraries and to read books in the future? And it's partly for that reason that I wrote this book, The Invention of Rare Books. As you will see, it covers a period, roughly speaking, from the early 17th century up to the middle of the 19th century. In other words, I've not attempted to go into modern times, except that I've written this book so that it's bookended with a prologue and a conclusion, address more general topics about how we should use libraries, what's happened to them, and what we can expect from them in the next few years. And these two chapters at the beginning and the end, they bookend a series of historical chapters which deal with what happened to the treatment of books as the trade and readership and libraries and collecting all developed between the early 17th century and the middle of the 19th century. So it's partly about people and it's partly about books. The key thing to remember is that at the moment we are facing, of course, an enormous change in the way we use books, the so-called digital revolution. This has all kinds of implications for us because it means that we can see much more than we ever could before, much more is available to us. But on the other hand, we also are in danger of losing a lot, not just because we're afraid that we might lose those digital files in the future, which might not last as long as paper, but more importantly, that what we read is actually being selected for us. Despite everything that's said about things being universally obtainable, everything's available online, this is not entirely true. So we have to think again about what we mean by selection. And this is where we come back to the idea of rare books, because the idea of rare books, select books, books that are chosen for their importance, books that have survived for all kinds of reasons, are actually what we live with today. We have to remember that we live today with a very incomplete record of the past. Why is it that we cope with this selective record of the past? If we look at the late 16th century, beginning of the 17th century, we can see a beginning of a development here. We can see it in the changeover from a manuscript tradition to a printed tradition. Manuscript books and printed books are gradually separated into two different lines of thought, not always very sensibly, not always very tidily. For example, in Cambridge University Library in the end of the 16th century, they were given a very large collection of early manuscripts, but they also were given a very large collection of printed books. And it's very curious that they shelved all the manuscripts separately from the printed books, with the exception of two printed books. An atlas by Ortelius, which of course is a very large book given to them in the 1580s, and a copy of the Nuremberg Chronicle, printed in Nuremberg in 1493. Now, these, of course, are two very large books, and the reason they were probably put with the manuscripts is simply because they were large. One has to remember always that there are exceptions to the rules and exceptions to what you might expect. In the 17th century, people began to think more carefully about collecting books. A man called Gabriel Naudet, working in Paris, talked not just about collecting important books, but also all kinds of trivial books as well, to get an idea of the range of what's printed. And of course, one of the difficulties in this is that there's so much printed, more than people can always imagine, and more than they can certainly afford to keep or to buy. And it's through this, through the late 17th century and into the 18th century, that we see a big change. The first change that we can see is easy to spot because a market grew up for old printed books. You must remember that all the time there are more and more old printed books coming onto the market as new books take their place. Now, in the early 17th century and through in the second part of the 17th century, book auctions began to get established. And most importantly, with those book auctions came printed catalogues of books, and with that, the chance to record the prices of books, and also to discover which books were coming up for sale and which were not, which books, in other words, were difficult to find. And so one finds people talking about the difficulty of getting hold of books that they can't acquire easily. And it's for this reason that in the 18th century, a big change happened. There was a whole series of guidebooks to rarity. It turned into a sort of parlor game where people began to try and think of the criteria by which they would judge a book to be rare. And this was not just numerically rare, but also where it happened to be rare in a particular place. So it might, for example, be easy to find a book in Paris, but much more difficult to find it in Rome. And the reasons for that are quite straightforward, that the international book trade is, of course, not uniform, and people's tastes are not uniform. So we get a dispersal of books, but at the same time, a very uneven dispersal of books. And this complicates the way in which we think of rarity, because we think not just of books being internationally rare, the way we can today. For example, if a copy of the Gutenberg Bible comes up for sale, everybody in the world knows about it in no time at all, because it's available on social media, on the radio, television, and everywhere else. This didn't happen in this 18th century. It was much more difficult to circulate knowledge of that kind. So here they are in the 18th century playing games. But at the same time, in the 18th century, there's an increasing number of very wealthy collectors, not just in Britain, of course, but also across Europe. And they are concentrating on some kinds of books. This is the next thing to remember about inventing rare books and the invention of the idea of rare books, that some kinds of books are more popular sometimes than others. So, for example, in the 18th century, the great concentration of books in the Latin and Greek classics, the first editions printed by Aldus Manutius and that sort of thing, and great interest in Bible printing, and great interest in some kinds of historical research. Not very much interest in the history of literature at that stage, in ordinary modern literature. The idea of trying to get hold of the first edition of Don Quixote doesn't really mean very much to people in the 18th century, whereas today people would give their eye teeth for it, as they say. There's a transition here from the private collector to the public. There's one important thing to remember here, that in the 18th century, the foundation of the British Museum was one amongst several large libraries that became internationally important for the collecting of early books. The Vatican obviously been in existence for many years. The British Museum Library, founded in 1753, was the creation out of several private collections. And so we see a shift from the private to the public. And that's the second important point I want to make in this book, this changeover from private responsibility for collecting books, identifying what's rare, to public responsibility, public ownership, and public access, which of course is the tradition we live with today. In the later part of the 18th century, the book trade was transformed. Two things happened. One is the suppression of the Jesuit order in the 1770s meant that a very large number of libraries were closed. Some of the books were sent to local collections, but an awful lot of them were put onto the market. So the market for early printed books in the 18th century, from the 1770s onwards, is transformed by very large numbers of books coming out for sale for the first time. A little bit later, when one looks at the suppression of monasteries in Germany, Austria, Italy, and so forth, one sees again very large numbers of books coming out onto the market. And the Napoleonic Wars, which finished in 1815 with the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, also was the time when, again, more books came onto the European market. At this stage, the main money that was available in Britain. Britain was far and away the most wealthy country for buying books. The French hated it. In fact, the French said repeatedly that all their books were being bought up by the perfidious Britons. Well, it's certainly the case that in the early 19th century, British collectors managed to put together very large numbers of books, many of them very rare. The famous example, of course, is the copy of Boccaccio that was sold at the Duke of Roxburgh's sale in 1812. Which fetched a record price that wasn't met again for another 50 years, a form of bibliomania which overtook many people. Bibliomania had existed since at least the 15th century, but by the 19th century was becoming a very serious issue. People collecting books simply for the sake of it, and the prices being driven up. The response to this was very interesting. through the early years of the 19th century, a whole series of different guides to the price of books came out. The tradition actually goes back to the 1770s in France, where Guillaume de Bure introduced his guide to the price of books and guide to rarity. But the main ones that were used from the later part of the 18th century and the 19th century were mostly, again, French. The first edition of Brunet, the manual by which some booksellers still swear today, came out in 1810. And that was an enormous list of books with records of prices and where they'd been sold. And there was a record for the first time on an international scale of which books were rare. Now, Brunet was a bookseller. He had his own ideas, but he, in successive editions that came out right the way through till well after the end of my period, produced the encyclopedia which everybody expected to use. Now, this, of course, meant that as the libraries in the 19th century developed further, this idea of a public collection, this idea of a collection which was beyond the private resources of an individual, it meant that they too were able to build up their collections. And it's this that we see in the founding of the very major collections in Paris, in the Réserve, where the librarian there set aside books specifically for books to be reserved in the Réserve, rare books, livres rares they call them now, but they were simply then they were select books. And the same kind of things happening in other libraries, a further division of responsibility for the collecting of them by libraries as the staff become more specialist. And generally speaking, the whole question of rare books and early books comes to the fore. Rare books become newsworthy in newspapers. By the middle of the 19th century, newspapers are reporting book sales with the prices of some books. The change here in libraries is very important because as through the 19th century, we see the growth and then the gradual diminution of many private libraries as they're forced to sell off because they get short of money. We see the growth of these major research libraries. And it's these libraries that we need to concentrate on today as we think about where we're going. The key thing is that no library can collect everything. I suppose in the early 16th century, the Biblioteca Colombina in Seville must have been the representative library collecting everything. Now that's Columbus's stepson was trying to buy right across Europe enormous quantities of books. But he failed. And of course, that library is now much of it being dispersed, though some of it is still together, fortunately. In the 19th century, there's no hope of collecting everything. Even in the British Museum, where I suppose the most famous librarian of the 19th century, a man called Antonio Panizzi, an immigrant from Italy, he escaped for political reasons from Italy and came to Britain to run the British Museum Library eventually. Even he didn't attempt to collect everything. When he had arguments with the government about the rights and the wrongs of trying to collect everything published just in this country, in Britain, even he said he couldn't do everything. And a lot of local publications were just ignored. So these libraries are selective despite their size. Now, there's all very well being selective, but what do you select? That actually is what's happened or emerged in the last few years as we've looked again at what has survived from the past, because it's become clear that libraries, by choosing to look after some kinds of books, have neglected other kinds, and they're books which very often are of great interest to us. The most obvious example, I suppose, is children's books. The great libraries of the world don't have large historic collections of children's books. The best ones that survive are the ones that have been built up recently, very often by private collectors. Educational books. It's very difficult now to find cheap school books. One of the most popular dictionaries published in the 18th century survives in only just a handful of copies. Yet these books were printed by the thousand at the time. We've similarly found that in the case of some of the most popular books of all, for example, almanacs, produced by the tens of thousands year by year for people, very often only half a dozen will survive. So the effect of this is that we have a very unbalanced view, if we're not careful, about our history, because what survives in libraries is, after all, part of the survival of history. So it's very difficult to recover now the extraordinary way in which some kinds of printing became so important so quickly, and other parts are much slower. And very often it's the more popular parts that we know least about. And that's what we've been worrying about in the last few years. Now, this, of course, I've said nothing at all about price of some of these cheaper books. They cost very little at the time. They now cost a great deal, and they're very difficult to find. That's the other difficulty, that rare books are defined not least by the market, by what you can find for sale at any one time. Just mention the oddity that we see at the moment, that if you want to buy, I suppose, the most famous book in the English language, the first folio of Shakespeare, his collected works, printed in 1623, copies of that actually turn up quite frequently. Many copies survive. If you want to buy a copy of the first edition of Don Quixote, 1605, you won't find it. The last copy, or the copy people always talk about, was sold many years ago in 1989. At $1.5 million. Now, if a copy were to turn up today, it would cost much more than that. And instead, the rare books we talk about today in the newspapers are quite different. The discovery of the first edition of a Harry Potter book makes the news headlines every time it turns up, because people want to buy Harry Potter, popular books. And it's the same sort of reflection we see from the past, that some books are fashionable and therefore treated as rare, and some people are unfashionable and people don't worry about them so much. And amidst all this, we have somehow, as libraries, to work through to ensure that the rare books of the past and of the present are kept for the future.